Most prisons are designed to punish, but some were designed to break you completely. Today we're counting down the 10 most brutal prisons in the world, places where the walls don't just hold you in, they slowly destroy everything you are. La Sabaneta prison in Venezuela was built in the 1940s to hold around 700 inmates. By the 1990s it was holding over 3,500 people, 5 times its capacity. But the overcrowding was just the beginning of the nightmare. Guards rarely entered the inner cell blocks. The prison was effectively run by the most violent gangs inside. Weapons including homemade knives, firearms, and even grenades were smuggled in regularly. Inmates had to pay gang leaders for food, for protection, and even for a place to sleep. In 1994, a riot broke out that lasted several days. When it was over, more than 100 inmates were dead. In 1995, another massacre killed around 200 more. The Venezuelan government was eventually forced to address conditions after international human rights organizations called La Sabaneta one of the most dangerous places on the planet. Located deep in the Syrian desert, near the ancient city of Palmyra, Tadmur prison was not just a place of incarceration, it was a deliberate instrument of state terror. Opened in the 1930s under French colonial rule, it became truly infamous under the Assad regime beginning in the 1970s. Political prisoners, dissidents, journalists, and anyone suspected of opposing the government were sent here, and simply disappeared from public record. Torture was systematic and documented: electric shocks, suspension from ceilings, beatings that lasted for hours. Former prisoners who survived described being held in total darkness for months with no human contact. In June 1980, one day after a failed assassination attempt on President Hafez al-Assad, military units entered Tadmur and executed between 500 and 1,000 inmates in a single morning. No trials, no hearings, just mass murder inside prison walls. The prison was partially destroyed in 2015, but its legacy remains one of the darkest in modern history. Diyarbakir military prison, in southeastern Turkey, became a symbol of systematic state brutality following the 1980 military coup. Political prisoners, Kurdish activists, and leftist detainees were sent here by the thousands. What happened inside was documented by survivors and human rights organizations for decades afterward. Inmates were subjected to prolonged torture sessions, forced to witness the abuse of other prisoners, and kept in conditions designed to destroy their psychological resistance. The prison became particularly notorious for its treatment of juvenile detainees. Teenagers as young as 14 were held alongside adults and subjected to the same brutal treatment. Many did not survive. Those who did carried permanent physical and psychological scars. The suicide rate inside Diyarbakir was among the highest ever recorded in any prison facility. Inmates chose death over another day inside those walls. Today the building still stands, and has become a dark historical landmark in Turkey's complicated political history. Almost everything we know about Camp 22 comes from a handful of defectors who somehow survived and escaped North Korea entirely, because once you enter Camp 22, you are erased. You don't exist anymore. Located in the remote Hwarang region near the Chinese border, Camp 22 is believed to have held between 30,000 and 50,000 political prisoners at its peak. And political prisoner in North Korea means almost anything: practicing religion, listening to foreign radio, telling the wrong joke about the regime. What makes Camp 22 uniquely horrifying is that entire families are imprisoned together. If your grandfather said something critical of the government in 1965, his children and grandchildren can be born inside this camp and die there without ever understanding why. Defectors have described forced labor in mines and farms from before sunrise to after dark, starvation rations, public executions carried out in front of all prisoners as warnings, and according to some accounts, human medical experiments conducted on inmates without anesthesia. The outside world has never been able to fully verify what happens inside because no independent observers have ever been granted access. The Casa de Deteno Paulo, known as Carandiru, was for decades the largest prison in Latin America. Built in 1920 to hold around 1,200 people, by the 1990s it was holding over 7,000 inmates in conditions of unimaginable overcrowding. Tuberculosis spread through the cell blocks unchecked. HIV infection rates among inmates were among the highest ever recorded in any institution in the world. Violence was constant. Inmates were effectively left to govern themselves because the official staff was completely overwhelmed. Then came October 2, 1992. A fight between two inmates escalated into a full prison riot. The São Paulo military police were called in to restore order. What happened next shocked Brazil and the world. Officers entered the cell blocks and opened fire. When it was over, 111 inmates were dead. None of the deaths were from crossfire. Inmates were found shot at close range, many in their cells, many trying to surrender. The Carandiru massacre became one of the most investigated events in Brazilian legal history. The prison was eventually demolished in 2002, but the memory of what happened inside its walls never disappeared. Black Dolphin sits near the town of Sololetsк in the Orenburg region of Russia, just a few miles from the Kazakh border. It was built to hold one specific category of prisoner: those convicted of the most extreme crimes imaginable. Serial killers, cannibals, terrorists, people who committed acts so horrific that Russian law deemed them unfit to ever walk free again. The facility currently holds around 700 inmates, all serving life sentences with no possibility of parole. The rules inside Black Dolphin are unlike any other prison in Russia. Inmates must walk at all times bent at the waist with their hands clasped behind their back, and a guard holding their arm. This is to prevent them from memorizing the layout of the facility. They sleep in shifts and are monitored by cameras 24 hours a day. They are never left unsupervised for a single moment. Among the inmates are some of Russia's most notorious criminals, men responsible for killing dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. The psychological pressure of total surveillance and zero freedom has driven many to the edge of sanity. And in the history of Black Dolphin, not one inmate has ever successfully escaped. A DX Florence in Colorado is the most secure prison facility in the United States, and arguably in the entire world. It is where America sends the people it never wants to see again. The facility holds around 400 inmates, all in permanent or long-term solitary confinement. Each cell is approximately 7 by 12 feet. Inmates spend 23 hours per day alone inside that space. The 1 hour of recreation they receive is in a slightly larger concrete room, alone, with no other prisoners present. Human contact is minimized to the absolute extreme. Food is delivered through a slot in the door. Medical checks happen through the door. Former inmates have described the silence as the most psychologically devastating aspect of a DX, not the physical conditions, but the complete absence of normal human interaction, day after day, year after year. Among those who have been held at a DX Florence, Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, Oklahoma City bombing co-conspirator Terry Nichols, World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef, and for a period, El Chapo, the Mexican cartel leader, whose previous escapes from maximum security facilities in Mexico made American authorities take no chances. Gitarama Central Prison in Rwanda was not designed to be the most brutal prison in the world. It became that way through catastrophic circumstance. After the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which approximately 800,000 people were killed in roughly 100 days, the Rwandan justice system was completely overwhelmed. Suspected perpetrators needed to be detained while awaiting trial. Gitarama was built for 400 people. At its peak in the mid-1990s, it held over 7,000. The overcrowding was so extreme that inmates could not all lie down at the same time. People stood for days on end, pressed against each other with no room to move. The ground became contaminated with human waste. Feet that stood in that contamination for days began to rot. Gangrene spread rapidly through the prison population. With no medical facilities to speak of, the only treatment was amputation, performed without anesthesia, with whatever tools were available. The death rate inside Gitarama in those years was staggering. International observers who visited described it as unlike anything they had ever seen. Not a prison but a slow death sentence for everyone inside. The Rock, sitting 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco in the middle of freezing, shark-patrolled waters. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary operated from 1934 to 1963 and housed some of America's most dangerous and escape-prone criminals. Al Capone was sent here when he continued to run his criminal empire from other prisons. Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and Mickey Cohen all did time on the Rock. The philosophy of Alcatraz was simple and brutal. You You get nothing here that you don't earn. Silence was enforced at meals for years. Work was mandatory. Contact with the outside world was minimal and heavily controlled. What made Alcatraz psychologically unique was its location. Inmates could hear San Francisco, the music, the foghorns. On New Year's Eve they could hear celebrations across the water, but they could never reach it. That proximity to freedom combined with absolute captivity drove many inmates to mental breakdown. In 29 years of operation, 36 men attempted to escape. Most were caught or killed. 5 vanished in the bay and were never found. The mystery of whether Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers actually survived their 1,962 escape has never been officially solved.
If Black Dolphin is Russia's most secure prison, Petak Island is its most isolating. Located on a small island in the middle of Lake Vygotsero in the Karelia region of northwestern Russia, Petak Island prison can only be reached by boat, and for much of the year. The lake is frozen solid, making access nearly impossible. The facility holds Russia's most dangerous lifers, men convicted of terrorism, multiple murders, and crimes against the state. Like Black Dolphin, inmates are held under conditions of near total isolation. They are locked in their cells for 20.5 hours per day. The half hour of movement they receive happens in a small enclosed exercise area, alone. The geographical isolation adds a layer of psychological weight that no other prison in the world can match. There is no city sound, no human activity outside the walls. In winter, temperatures drop to -30 degrees Celsius. The island disappears under snow and ice. The world outside simply ceases to exist. Former staff members have described working at Petak Island as one of the most psychologically demanding jobs in the Russian prison system, though not because of the danger from inmates, but because of the crushing silence and isolation that affects everyone inside those walls, guards and prisoners alike. These 10 facilities represent the extreme edge of what humanity has built to contain its most dangerous and sometimes its most vulnerable. Which one shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more videos like this every week, subscribe. We're just getting started.